Hey again, this is Jerry Roberts, and today we're going to pick up continuing our discussions about the tensions in crossing cultures. And the lecture, this particular video, is going to be about tensions about accomplishing goals and the difference between a task orientation and a people orientation. Like so many others, this is not just a simple yes-no question. This is a continuum. And like in many situations, the USA tends to be on the far end of this scale, while the islands and the Middle Eastern peoples tend to be on the other end. And it's interesting. We'll talk about this in a minute, but that sometimes some of the Far Eastern countries tend to have both orientations and kind of divide them up in a peculiar way. But task orientation, and once we look into what a task-oriented person is like and what a people-oriented person is like, you can choose for yourself and look at where you think you land on the spectrum. But remember, the purpose of this spectrum is not just to kind of get knowledge about this, but to be aware of the fact that wherever you land on the spectrum, there are people other places on that spectrum, on that continuum, and we need to be willing to make adjustments in how we respond and how we understand the task and people orientation so that we can be effective in growing with and ministering to other people. As I said, it's kind of interesting because the task versus people orientation, America tends to be very task-oriented. Countries like Germany, needs to be Belgium, Switzerland, a lot of places like that tend to be mostly task-oriented places. Countries, some of the African, South American countries, a lot of the island cultures tend to be very people-oriented cultures. But it's interesting how in the Far East, especially in Japan and in some parts of China, more developed China, they have this interesting blend where they are very, very task-oriented when it comes to work. And then they shift to being very people-oriented when it's outside of work. They'll show up at 6 a.m. and work 12-hour days to get the task accomplished. But then when they are not in that actual work environment, they will sit and visit with friends for 10 hours and not be the least bit worried about how much time they're taking to visit with friends. And so they have this interesting thing where they seem to have they're task-oriented for some things and people-oriented for other things. Whereas usually people maintain task orientation or people orientation in many different settings. And so, as I said, this is one of those people kind of slip back and forth a little bit on, but we all have a tendency to be more one way or more the other. So when you're looking at the tension over goals, we have this, once again, this list of comparisons. Tensions over goals. Here's the deal. A task-oriented person says the goal is the completion of the task, which sounds kind of silly. Of course, that's what a person would say. But it doesn't matter what has to happen to get the job done. Getting the job done is what matters. It doesn't matter what other things have to be sacrificed. Getting the job done is what matters. A person who is truly a task-oriented person might be willing to cause a breakdown in relationship in order to make sure to get what they wanted to get done. A task-oriented person might say something like, "Oh, I'm sorry I had to do that. Sorry that happened, but you got in my way. I was on task. I was in my go mode, and I'm sorry I got angry with you, but you know how I get when I'm getting focused on the task." Task-oriented people, as they develop friendships, they tend to develop friendships and relationships around people who have the same mindset or goals. In other words, friendships and relationships seem to be tied in some way to what their goals are in life. You're not. They seek friendships that might we have this whole thing called networking in America. And networking is about not just developing friendships, but about developing connections with, relationships with people who can help us to eventually meet our goals. The ultimate example of this would be like a politician who their whole goal is to become senator or to become congressman or to become whatever else in the future. And everything that they do, every relationship they build, everything that they form, it's all about finding people who are going to help them along the way to the accomplishment of their goal. A task-oriented person, and this is a very important one, a person who is deeply task-oriented, accepts loneliness and social deprivation as the price to be paid for success. I'll read that one again. A task-oriented person accepts loneliness and social deprivation as the price to be paid for success. We have a saying in the States, and the saying is, it's lonely at the top. You may not have heard that one very often, but it's a common phrase. It's lonely at the top. Meaning that if you're going to be someone great, if you're going to be that person who truly accomplishes the top goal and becomes the CEO, the director of the corporation, the president, the senator, whatever else, that the only way to get there is to be willing to be lonely, be willing to be socially deprived so that you're able to accomplish your goal. And once you get there, be aware of the fact that, okay, I may be lonely, but I finally accomplished my goal. Okay, so, and once again, we're speaking about the extremes of task orientation. Most people are not that extremely task-oriented, but many of us tend to have more of a task orientation and a willingness to put aside relational things in order to accomplish goals. As a matter of fact, again, our U.S. culture tends to glorify and reward that. I remember when I was working my PhD studies, I was sometimes spending 4 and 5 hours a day researching and writing for my dissertation. And I found a way to make sure and keep in balance, still spending time with my family, spending time with my grandkids, spending time, doing other things. I found time. I did my research while other people were doing other things, so I could still spend time with them and such. But I've known of people who were going through their PhD studies, and it was like their wives and children didn't see them for 2 years. Or their families, their friends didn't see them for 2 or 3 years while they're digging deep in this research. And we reward people like that by giving them a PhD. There's this expectation that there's going to be some loneliness. You're going to have to set aside relationships to accomplish this goal. And so it is interesting. We tend to reward people who are task-oriented. On the other hand, we have people-oriented. The people-oriented tendency, relationships nurtured is more important than what is accomplished as the material outcome. The statement might be, we didn't get finished, but we had a good time together. These are people who it is not about getting a task accomplished, but about developing relationship together. The statement would be, the task completion may not last long, but the friendship will go on and on. So a people-oriented person, let's say we're doing a campus cleanup day, and our job is to go around and pull weeds and pick up trash and clean things up around the campus or whatever else. The task-oriented person, like me, would be laying out quadrants of, 50 yards by 50 yards and putting individual people in each one of those and saying, this is your square right here, you finish this square, and then we'll get this job done as quickly as possible. The people-oriented person would all wander around in a group of 3 or 4 people and talk and pull a couple of weeds and talk and pick up a little trash and talk, but their goal would be the personal interaction involved in doing it. Now, the question is, do you want the job done, or do you want to have the relationships? Now, the truth is, I don't think you have to have one or the other. I think both can happen. But a people-oriented group is not going to get the task accomplished as well as the task-oriented person. But the task-oriented person might have everybody mad at them by the end of the day. So it's this weird quandary here. A people-oriented person, they deplore loneliness. And they will even sacrifice success for the sake of belonging to the group. This is something that just boggles the mind of a task-oriented culture. But there are people who literally will not work as hard as they can, will not share all the new ideas that they're having, because they're afraid that they will be promoted or moved up or moved into a different group, a different class, and the fear of being left alone is such that they would rather stay mediocre and stay as part of the group than to achieve something great but be alone. And as I said, for a task-oriented culture, that's perplexing to us. But there are people that makes absolutely sense in their brains, and they don't understand why you would be willing to sacrifice your friendships just so you can get a better job, just so you can get that promotion, just so that you can move up the career ladder. Why would you do that when that means you leave behind the friends that are so important to you? And so it's a very interesting difference that we see here. Now, as I said, we need to remember, it's not good versus evil, not good versus bad. It is not that task orientation is automatically evil and people orientation is automatically good, or vice versa. It's about the fact that some people are more task oriented and some are more people oriented, and we need to be aware of this and need to be able to adjust to this as much as we can to be effective around other people. I've mentioned this once before, I believe, but just to throw it out here again, there is this tendency among Westerners that when we start studying about these other orientations, to idealize them. When we look at the time, the polychronic versus monochronic time, and then we look at task versus people orientation, and we see these people who, oh man, they don't worry about getting things accomplished. They just, they'll sit around and chew on the betel nut and talk for hour after hour, and they're all about people. They're all about relationships. And man, it's just, we just need to be more like that. Just remember, if you're in a truly people-oriented culture, nothing gets done. And I mean nothing gets done. Even the things you want to get done don't get done. Even the things you need done by tomorrow don't get done by tomorrow. Because in your task orientation says, if I order something from Amazon, it needs to be here within 48 hours. Well, guess what? In a people-oriented culture, maybe 48 days. Once again, Lingenfelter talked about in the island of Yap that the group decided that they wanted to build a new school building. And so it was going to be a cooperative effort. The Western organization was going to provide the materials, but then the Yapese, the people from the actual island, were going to provide the labor. That way they would be their building. It wouldn't be just the building the Americans dropped in there that then they ignored later on. And so he got the materials brought in, they piled up the materials, and they made the plan, and they began working on the building. Now, I haven't read the story this year, so I may get the numbers wrong. I believe that he said that it took 18 years to complete that building. Because they would build on it a while, and then somebody would need something built on their house, and so they'd quit here and they'd go work on the person's house for 6 months. And then they'd build on it for a while, and then a hurricane would hit, so they had to rebuild all the structures around again. And then they'd work on it a while, and then be a good fishing season, and so they'd go out for 6 months and come back. 18 years to finish a building that in the States might take 18 months. Probably not even that long, because I'm sure it was not a really complicated structure. Kind of the place we might put up with a 3-week missionary team. All right, so remember, you may think you want to be people-oriented, But do remember that when you begin adjusting, and I'm not saying you should be, I'm saying we need to become more people oriented. And if you're going to work in a cross-cultural environment, you're going to have to become more people oriented. But the sacrifice you're going to have to make is to be willing to understand, like I did, that, oh my goodness, I was just remembering back. We arrived November 7th, 1997 in Latvia. We began working on our residence permits by the end of November. We were supposed to have them within 3 months, because if we didn't have them within 3 months, we technically weren't allowed to stay in the country anymore. Luckily, after we'd been there about 2 months, we left Latvia and went to Russia for a week for a conference. When we re-entered, we got another 3 months. Turned in paperwork, turned in paperwork, turned in paperwork. Every time we turned in paperwork, thought we were done. Next time I would go in thinking I was going to pick up my residence permit. Oh, yes, we forgot to inform you. We need a new copy of your wife's birth certificate. Okay, go get that. We're having to get it from Canada, for Pete's sake, you know. So we get that, bring it up to them. Then I go back 2 weeks later, and they say, oh yeah, you know, we forgot that we actually need, your marriage license needs to have an apostille on it. I'm going, what in the world's an apostille? Well, it's a document showing that the person who signed this document was actually truly a person who was allowed to sign the document. So I have to send it back to the U.S., send it to the state of Texas, bring it back, bring that, turn it in. Go back 2 weeks later, oh yeah, we forgot to tell, oh yeah, we forgot. And so literally, I think it was mid-March, we had to travel to Lithuania and stay in Lithuania, I think, for 48 hours or something, so we could come back into the country again and reset our time again. Basically, it took, I think it was April or May. It took nearly 6 months to finish our first residence permit because they were people-oriented people. Now, I'm just going to say this on tape once, and you can do with it what you want. On the second time I took my residence permits the next year, I had learned some things about how the culture operated. And I went to pick up my paperwork. I filled out all the forms. I got all the things I was supposed to have. And when I brought them back to turn them in, I also handed the person a box of chocolates. You can call it bribery if you want to, but you need to probably go back and read some of the things in the book of Proverbs about a gift making the heart of the king glad. The chocolate helped. We got our residence permits in 2 months rather than the 6 months it took us the last time. Anyway, all I'm trying to say is understand that as a task-oriented person, and even if you're pretty people-oriented for an American, you still want things to be done on time. You're going to have to be willing to surrender the impatience that task-oriented people have. Task-oriented people tend to be impatient. They want the job to get done. They want the job to get done quickly. People-oriented cultures are wonderful. They're wonderful. You sit for hours and drink tea and talk and carry on and till all hours, then they're wonderful. You develop amazing relationships. But if your cell phone gets broken, it's not going to be fixed. Maybe ever. So just understand. It's not going to be fixed in 48 hours. It's not going to be fixed in 48 days. It may be fixed, maybe never. Just buy a new cell phone. So I just understand that. What you're going to have to surrender is the impatience that comes from being task-oriented. So just thought I'd throw that in there to kind of wrap this up here. The next time we come together, we'll be talking about some tensions that are caused about self-worth, which is another entirely interesting subject.